The individual recognized historically as Saddam Hussein was born in the village of Al-Awya, located northwest of Baghdad in Iraq, on April 28, 1937. Al-Awya is a tiny village situated in the vicinity of Tikrit. Hussein Abd al-Majid, his father, was a desert shepherd. While certain testimonies propose that he forsaken his family prior to Saddam's birth, the more plausible explanation is that he passed away in the winter of 1936 or 1937 from throat cancer. His kinship traces back several generations to the Albu Nazir tribe, which had previously relocated from Yemen in the southwestern region of the Arabian Peninsula to Iraq. The mother of Saddam Hussein was named Subba Talfa al-Musallah. Her lineage was of greater prestige. Talva ibn Musallah, a descendant of the former governor of the region of Tikrit, Emir Omar Bey III, was one of her ancestors. She and Hussein had an additional son years prior to Saddam's birth in 1937. This son also seems to have passed away shortly before Saddam's arrival. Subba entered into a subsequent matrimonial union with Ibrahim al-Hassan Muhammad, which resulted in the birth of multiple half-siblings for Saddam. He observed little of them, however. Saddam's mother made an effort to terminate her pregnancy following the death of her first spouse, and she remained unwarm towards her son after his birth. Saddam's troubled familial background afflicted his adolescence. Throughout his childhood, Saddam was subjected to severe physical abuse at the hands of his strict stepfather, which was so traumatic that he fled his family residence as a child and began residing with an uncle in Baghdad, the capital city of Iraq. He matriculated at the Al-Qahr Secondary School located in Baghdad. He was a student of moderate integrity who would eventually commence his legal studies. His uncle, Khairallah Talva, exerted a significant impact on Saddam during this period. However, he never shirked his ties to Tikrit, and many years later, when he ascended to power in Iraq, he elevated members of his extended family to positions of considerable authority and significance in that city. Particularly in what is now Iraq, but throughout the Middle East, Hussein came of age during a time of profound transformation. Since the 16th century, the majority of the area had been governed by a small number of potent Islamic empires, namely the Ottoman Empire or the Persians. The territories that border Iraq to the north, west, and south, which are now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, were under Ottoman rule. Early in the 20th century, their dominion over these regions was already deteriorating significantly. However, the Ottoman Empire's support for the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary during the First World War ultimately resulted in its demise in 1918. Upon the conclusion of the conflict, Britain and France, the victorious powers, partitioned the Middle East between themselves and established a system of mandates to govern the area. As a result of these mandates, new nations were formed that incorporated relatively few of the regional identities and distinctions that characterized the region. On the contrary, British and French policymakers compelled groups to unite along demarcated lines in the desert dunes. The Kingdom of Iraq was ostensibly granted independence in 1932 during the reign of King Faisal I. However, Britain maintained immense control over the country, including management of its vast oil fields through the Iraqi Petroleum Company, which was primarily under British control. Saddam was 2 years old when the Second World War erupted. This circumstance continued to persist. Throughout the conflict, numerous political factions in nations such as Iraq conspired with the Nazis in an effort to end British involvement in Iraq. The Iraqi monarchy was perceived as complicit with Britain by them on account of their ongoing support for the British Empire. A comprehensive comprehension of Saddam Hussein's ascent and Iraqi politics during the latter half of the 20th century necessitates an evaluation of the Ba'ath Party's establishment in Syria in 1947. Its anti-imperialist and pan-Arabist platform facilitated its rapid expansion into other Middle Eastern nations, most notably Iraq in 1951, where a branch was established. Khairallah, the uncle of Saddam, was a founding member. Since its inception, the party has been predominantly affiliated with the Sunni branch of Islam. which is one of the two prevailing branches of Islam in Iraq alongside the Shia. Ba'athism, in contrast, did not constitute a theological or religious movement. By endorsing socialism and proposing a novel approach to governance in the Arab world, it effectively repudiated the pervasive influence of religion across the region. Conversely, Ba'athism advocated for the notion that every Muslim state in the Middle East ought to strive towards eliminating the last vestiges of imperialism and collaborate in order to re-establish the Arab people's prominence and influence on a global scale, as they had done during the Muslim empire's zenith centuries prior. With this objective in mind, they were generally opposed to the governments that had been established in nations such as Iraq and Syria following the conclusion of mandate control by the British and French during the interwar period. As a result, the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was positioned to confront the Iraqi monarchy and government in their post-World War II state. At the age of 20, Saddam joined the Iraqi Ba'ath Party in 1957. During that period, the party constituted a comparatively modest movement, with a membership in Baghdad and a few other major cities amounting to no more than a few hundred individuals. However, something of a paradigm shift was imminent in Iraqi affairs when Saddam began to take a significant interest in the nation's politics. Iraq had emerged as a tumultuous region of political opposition by the mid-1950s. This was largely attributable to the incompetence of King Faisal II and his ministers, but Iraqis also drew inspiration from Egypt, where military officers overthrew King Farouk in 1952 and installed a new regime that sought to end British influence in the country. However, similar to Iraq, British influence in Egypt persisted, particularly in the vicinity of the Suez Canal. The 14th of July Revolution of 1958 in Iraq exhibited numerous parallels with the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. During the Iraqi Revolution, military commanders including Abdul Salam Arif and Abd al-Karim Qasim spearheaded a coup d'état that toppled the government of King Faisal II on July 14, 1958. Within a few hours, the government was seized and a new Iraqi republic was proclaimed. The monarch and several members of his family were murdered during the uprising. Notwithstanding its relatively modest scale, the Ba'ath Party possessed adequate clout in Baghdad's political sphere to enable a limited number of its most prominent members to participate in the establishment of a novel regime led by army colonels during the summer and autumn of 1958. Thus, although Hussein was an obscure 21-year-old during this period, by the late 1950s he had already emerged as a figure on the periphery of the nation's highest political echelons. The government that was instituted in 1958 exhibited complete instability. A multitude of distinct entities and parties vied for power, with a significant number of them vehemently opposed to one another. For example, the Iraqi Communist Party emerged swiftly as a formidable adversary of the Ba'ath Party, whereas Qasim, the army commander who spearheaded the 14th of July Revolution and served as the nominal head of state of the nascent republic, exhibited a reluctance to align with the United Arab Republic, a political entity founded by Egypt that promoted pan-Arabism and led to a protracted political alliance with Syria. Desperate to assassinate Qasim, the Ba'athists were enraged by his refusal to comply in this matter. Saddam was selected for the assassination team. On October 7, 1959, as Qasim was driving through Al-Rashid Street in Baghdad in a car, they opened fire. Although Qasim was wounded twice, the bullets missed his arm and shoulder, and he managed to survive the assault. There has been speculation that Saddam began firing prematurely, which led to the failure of the attack. Although he was personally wounded in the leg by Qasim's security detail during the attempted assassination, he managed to flee the location. Following the unsuccessful assassination attempt, the intended assassins were secreted from Iraq to Syria, where Saddam Hussein joined the Syrian branch of the Ba'ath Party without delay. Returning to Iraq, a number of individuals were apprehended in relation to the aborted assassination endeavor, and evidentiary proceedings were conducted. Saddam relocated to Egypt for a period of time and attended the University of Cairo to further his legal education, but he was unable to successfully complete his degree. During his presence in 1963, Two coups transpired in the eastern region. A military division in Syria under the authority of the Ba'ath Party executed a coup d'état in March of that year, leading to the formation of Ba'athist Syria. Hafiz al-Assad, one of the military officers implicated, would ascend to power and govern Ba'athist Syria 8 years later. To the present day, the al-Assad family has maintained control over Syria. This occurred weeks prior to the Ramadan Revolution in Iraq, during which Ba'athist-led elements of the Iraqi army overthrew and seized authority from Qassem's government. Nevertheless, their reign in Baghdad was brief, lasting only 9 months, before Abdul Salam Arif, a former ally of Qassem's from the 1958 rebellion, seized power and purged the Ba'athists from the government. Saddam Hussein had returned to Iraq by the time of the November 1963 counter-coup, having departed Egypt shortly after his party seized power in Egypt the year prior. After the November 1963 coup and subsequent Ba'athist purge, he was re-elected to Iraq and maintained operations in the capital using cells comprised of the residual Ba'athist party members. He was apprehended in 1964 and subsequently convicted of membership in an illicit political organization. As punishment, he was sentenced to a number of years in prison. Saddam was subsequently incarcerated in October 1964 as a result of his involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate Arif. Nevertheless, his incarceration would be of a lesser duration than initially planned by the Iraqi government. In 1966, he evaded apprehension 2 years into his sentence. At this particular moment, Saddam, who was approaching his 31st birthday at the time, began to ascend the ranks of the Iraqi Ba'athist movement. Following his apprehension from prison, he was promptly designated as a regional leader of the party. It was immediately recognized that he was an adept organizer capable of expanding the organization amidst a time when divisions were within it regarding the extent of its continued collaboration with the Soviet Union and other Marxist-Leninist states. Saddam was also married and beginning a family at this time. Shortly after his return from Egypt in 1963, but prior to his arrest and imprisonment, he wed his first cousin, Sajida Talva. This was an arranged marriage to the daughter of his uncle. It resulted in offspring shortly thereafter. Subsequent to the birth of a son named Uday in 1964, another boy named Kasi was born in 1966. In 1968, Ragad, Rana, and Hala, 3 daughters, were born in 1969 and 1972, respectively. Not only did Saddam Hussein have these offspring. In 1986, he entered into a subsequent matrimonial union with Samira Shabanda. Furthermore, it is postulated that he was married to a 3rd and 4th wife, although the veracity of these claims remains uncertain. Although it is likely that Saddam had additional children through these extramarital affairs, his first marriage and the subsequent children were his most important. Despite the harsh nature of his political career, he was occasionally recognized for his philanthropic and charitable endeavors while simultaneously employing chemical weapons as conventional wartime weapons and committing genocide against portions of the Iraqi people. This was just the first of numerous contradictions associated with him. It is possible to say that Saddam Hussein's rise to political power in Iraq commenced on July 17, 1968, with the Ba'athists achieving absolute authority over the Iraqi state during the 17th of July revolution. The Six-Day War, which escalated tensions throughout the Middle East, was initiated by Israel and Egypt. Egypt, on the other hand, formed an alliance with a number of Arab states, including Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. This, in conjunction with the Republican government in Baghdad's inclination towards stronger relations with the United States, influenced numerous individuals, including the Ba'athists, to conclude that Iraq required a radical transformation of its political system. As a consequence, factions affiliated with the Ba'athist movement and the Iraqi military executed a virtually nonviolent coup on July 17, 1968, thereby seizing authority over the Baghdad government. The expanding diplomatic relations between the nation and the United States was censured, prompting the installation of a Ba'athist regime headed by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Hussein was swiftly designated Vice President of the Republic of Iraq, in part because of his assistance in purging the Ba'athist movement of prominent figures who opposed Ahmed's government program in the late 1960s. Ahmed was the cousin of Saddam Hussein. It marked the inception of his ascent to the position of Iraq's monarch. Over the subsequent decade, Saddam Hussein solidified his indispensability in the Ba'athist regime's administration of Iraq. Commencing the process of transforming Iraq into one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East, he oversaw extensive economic reforms and was an effective administrator. A significant portion of this was predicated on Iraq's oil reserves, the nation possessing some of the most sizable proven oil fields globally, which to this day continue to render the Iraqi economy predominantly oil-dependent 50 years later. However, upon the Ba'athists' rise to power in 1968, the energy industry of the country remained largely under the control of American and British oil companies, which represented Western interests. In the early 1970s, Saddam initiated a proactive process of nationalizing the companies. These nationalization efforts were facilitated by the 1973 energy crisis, which caused the Middle East's major oil suppliers to restrict their supplies to Western nations, including the United States and Britain. These states had previously provided assistance to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, which pitted Israel against several of its Arab neighbors, most notably Egypt and Syria. The price of a barrel of oil increased by approximately 300%, from around $3 to $12. As a result of these external conflicts and Saddam Hussein's timely nationalization of the Iraqi oil industry, oil revenues bolstered the Iraqi exchequer exponentially. The Ba'athists were able to initiate the modernization of Iraq and execute an ambitious series of social policies during the early to mid-1970s, when oil revenues started to pour into the country. For a brief period, Iraq had the highest standard of living among the Muslim countries of the Middle East. Saddam was largely accountable for the supervision of this. As an illustration, under his leadership, an education campaign was launched that resulted in a substantial surge in the literacy rates of both males and females throughout the nation. Additionally, he oversaw the implementation of a universal system of fundamental healthcare. UNESCO granted him official recognition for his endeavors in recognition of these endeavors. Furthermore, Saddam sought to establish a more stable and sustainable foundation for the Iraqi economy by utilizing the oil revenues generated in the 1970s to establish modern infrastructure and establish new enterprises nationwide. The objective was to achieve economic diversification, ensuring that in the event of a future decline in oil revenues, Iraq could still thrive on the foundations of its emerging industries. Hussein also endeavored to develop the agricultural sector of the country, placing significant emphasis on the implementation of mechanization in agricultural operations as a substitute for antiquated plows and archaic pre-industrial farming methods. From a foreign policy standpoint, Iraq also underwent a realignment during the 1970s. Hussein, in his capacity as a socialist Ba'athist, was initially dedicated to reorienting Iraq towards the Soviet Union and away from the United States and other Western powers. This shift had been inexorably compelled by the early 1970s nationalization of Western energy companies in Iraq. 1972 saw the signing of a 15-year economic and diplomatic cooperation treaty between the Soviet Union and Iraq. As a response, the United States administration led by President Richard Nixon initiated the provision of assistance to the Kurds residing in northern Iraq, who were seeking self-determination in the area. This ultimately resulted in the commencement of the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War in 1974. This war was a resumption of a protracted dispute that had been pervasive in Iraq since the 1960s, but has subsided since the Ba'athist government and the Mustafa Barzani-led Kurds began peace negotiations in the early 1970s. However, Saddam succeeded in mitigating this menace through his mediation of the 1975 Algiers Accords, a diplomatic accord between Iraq and Iran that was facilitated by Algeria's leader, Houari Boumediene. By means of this agreement, Iran consented to discontinue its provision of military and logistical support to the Kurds of Iraq, in exchange for a minor territorial concession along the Shatt al-Arab River. Northern Iraq was firmly re-established under the government in Baghdad, and the Kurdish military unrest was swiftly subdued. However, this would not be Hussein's final significant intervention in the Kurdish region. During the latter part of the 1970s, Saddam Hussein ascended to an unparalleled position of power in Iraq. During the early to mid-1970s, he established himself as the Ba'athist regime's second-in-command, trailing only his cousin, President al-Bakr. Throughout this time, he was intimately involved in the management of the Iraqi economy, foreign policy elements, and a vast array of other concerns. Furthermore, Saddam was elevated to the title of general in the Iraqi army in 1976. Al-Bakr, who was beginning to suspect that Saddam was attempting to secure absolute power in Iraq, initiated negotiations with the Ba'athist regime in neighboring Syria in the late 1970s. The two nations would form a political union under which al-Bakr would serve as the senior ruler until his death or retirement, and then President Hafez al-Assad of Syria would succeed him. By ensuring al-Bakr's removal from power, this arrangement would have effectively precluded Saddam from assuming the position of the subsequent sovereign of Iraq. On 16 July 1979, Saddam implemented a strategic maneuver akin to a game of chess in order to consolidate his power. With the backing of the military and several high-ranking members of the Ba'athist government, he compelled al-Bakr to tender his resignation as the president of Iraq. Saddam subsequently assumed the position of chief of state in a bloodless coup the same day. Iraq would continue to be under his dominion for the following 24 years. As one of his initial responsibilities as the Ba'athist regime's new head of state in Iraq, Saddam Hussein purged the Ba'athist party of his adversaries and any prospective power rivals. On July 22, 1979, precisely 6 days after he assumed power, this transpired. Al-Qud Hall in Baghdad was the location of a gathering of the Ba'athist party's highest and middle-ranking officials, which Saddam arranged in accordance with his accession of power. Upon entering the hall, the attendees of the celebration were greeted with an unforeseen declaration. In his address to them, Saddam asserted that he had uncovered a fifth column operating within the Ba'athist party, whose purpose was to subvert their authority over the Iraqi state and ultimately facilitate the Ba'athist Party of Syria's takeover of Iraq. Mahi Abdul Hussein, a former private secretary to al-Bakr, subsequently emerged to acknowledge his personal involvement in the conspiracy, stating that he had been a participant since 1975. He proceeded to provide a list of 68 additional complicit members of the party. It is unknown whether he was subjected to torture or whether his family was threatened to guarantee this confession. It is established that Abdul Hussein and the other 68 conspirators were escorted to a detention facility. Following that, a special criminal court was convened for the subsequent 2 weeks, during which show trials were conducted. In the end, 21 people were put to death, and others were removed from their positions as Saddam Hussein eliminated all opposition. During the purge that occurred in the summer of 1979, diplomatic ties between the Ba'athists of Syria and Iraq also deteriorated. In the summer of 1979, the purge of the Ba'ath Party and the manner in which Saddam gained power established the tone for his reign as Iraqi dictator. Hussein regressed from being an effective politician in the 1970s, when he implemented numerous beneficial reforms and raised the living standards of a large number of Iraqi citizens, to a more megalomaniacal authoritarian tyrant upon assuming power in 1979. Saddam Hussein instituted a reign of terror in the early 1980s that spanned more than 2 decades. This was accomplished through the use of secret police agencies and paramilitary organizations, including the Iraqi Popular Army and Mukhabarat and Iraqi Intelligence Service. Throughout this period, political dissidents were surveilled extensively, and certain groups were actively persecuted, including the Kurds and radical Shia Muslims. Illicit arrest, detention, and torture of tens of thousands of Iraqis for suspected dissent were also perpetrated. This influence even transcended Iraqi borders. In the 1980s, the Mukhabarat was liable for the execution of Iraqi political dissidents abroad, in countries as diverse as Sudan and Sweden. By observing all of this, Saddam solidified his reputation as a tyrant throughout history. In the 1980s, the rise of this escalating tyranny coincided with the emergence of a cult of leadership. Saddam preferred to portray himself as the heir apparent to the legendary great monarch of ancient Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and even had archaeological sites throughout Iraq bearing his name engraved on them. These sites dated back thousands of years. In various locations across Iraq, emulation statues were constructed in his honor, and his likeness began to permeate every aspect of Iraqi society, including murals adorning the sides of buildings in Baghdad and the other main urban centers and towns of the country. 2 simulated national elections were conducted over time, the first in 1995 and the second in 2002. In both, Hussein allegedly won nearly 100% of the vote, a ridiculous spectacle that was characteristic of many dictators of the 20th century. Such demonstrations of authoritarian authority may appear extravagant and ineffectual, but they were remarkably successful for many dictators of the 20th century. Their pervasiveness in all spheres of public life effectively persuaded the populace that there was only one plausible leader of their country. This, in conjunction with the heinous operations of the secret police and other state services, ensured that Saddam Hussein maintained an iron fist over power in Iraq starting in 1979, despite the country's economy rapidly deteriorating due to dwindling oil revenues and an extended conflict with Iran. The conflict with Iraq's eastern neighbor, Iran, dominated and shaped a significant portion of the first half of Saddam Hussein's rule over Iraq. The 1979 Iranian Revolution ousted the tyrannical Shah of Iran, who had been backed by the West, and installed Ruhollah Khomeini and his Islamist adherents in power. At this time, this region was a theocracy or religious state ruled by Shia Muslims. A significant proportion of the Muslim population in Iraq belonged to the Shia faith, whereas Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party predominantly consisted of Sunni Muslims. These 2 Muslim sects had diverged more than a millennium prior due to a disagreement regarding the succession of the Arab Muslim Caliphate. In the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, the Ba'athists in Iraq were apprehensive that Khomeini and his adherents would attempt to undermine their Western neighbor by appealing to the Shia majority in Iraq and spreading Islamist ideology throughout the country, while the Ba'athists themselves sought a more secular regime. As soon as the revolution began, hostilities escalated, largely at the behest of Saddam Hussein, who was optimistic about receiving Western assistance from nations such as the United States that desired to see the Iranian Revolution defeated or substantially reversed. By September 1980, he had consequently instigated hostilities. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for the next 8 years, was one of the most violent conflicts in modern Middle Eastern history. The subsequent war can be characterized as a border dispute, beginning in late 1980 when Iraq initiated an invasion of western Iran. This incursion was short-lived in 1981 and was followed by a counteroffensive from Iran. Saddam Hussein made it abundantly plain by 1982 that he would contemplate peace negotiations and a cessation of hostilities, as the anticipated swift triumph had degenerated into a war of attrition. Nevertheless, by that juncture, Iran had gained the upper hand due to its military expansion and tactical progressions. Rather than pursuing peace terms, the revolutionary government invaded Iraq and nearly occupied the region surrounding the Iraqi capital of Basra in the mid-1980s. Nevertheless, subsequent to this, the military situation underwent yet another transformation as Saddam Hussein's regime augmented the military draft and received augmented levels of assistance from external powers. The Iraqi military command was taken aback when, in 1985, they successfully executed a new offensive, but similar to 1980 and 1981, it faltered and was countered by an Iranian counteroffensive. This Iranian counteroffensive culminated in the capture of Al-Faw in southern Iraq in 1986. However, despite this, the Iranian government was unable to capitalize with further advances, and the conflict descended into a state of impasse once more. Over the years, The Iran-Iraq War has been the subject of considerable discourse regarding two specific facets. One factor was the backing that Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athists in Iraq obtained from Western powers, including the United States. Unquestionably, this was the situation, and no attempt was made to conceal it. Throughout the 1980s, the US Congress held regular hearings regarding the amount of assistance Hussein received. This materialized as financial support and military supplies and was arguably pivotal in averting an Iranian triumph during specific junctures of the conflict in 1982 and 1983. Nonetheless, it must be noted that this in no way implied that the United States considered Saddam Hussein and Iraq to be allies during the 1980s. Instead, they held the belief that Iran represented the greater of two atrocities and were prepared to offer assistance to Iraq in order to prevent an Iranian conquest of the country. The second significant aspect of the conflict that has gained notoriety was Iraq's utilization of chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas and sarin, especially when the country faced existential threats from Iranian advances. Conversely, the extensive deployment of child combatants by the Iranian military resulted in the tragic loss of tens of thousands of adolescents in combat throughout the duration of the conflict. The conflict ultimately reached a conclusion. Despite Iran maintaining the upper hand for a significant portion of the conflict and regaining it in 1986 and 1987, domestic fatigue for the country's armed forces and the gradual depletion of military resources and personnel were consequences. Additionally, the possibility of delivering a decisive strike to Iraq appeared remote. In this particular context, Saddam Hussein issued a dire warning to Tehran, threatening to escalate the use of chemical weapons and launch a fresh bombardment campaign in 1988 if the Iranian government failed to engage in negotiations. Tehran recognized that in light of the apparent reluctance of Western nations to tame Saddam Hussein's worst impulses, it was necessary to engage in negotiations. This was exacerbated in July 1988 when the United States shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, an action that alarmed the Ayatollah and others in Iran due to concerns that further American intervention was imminent. In light of this, peace terms were reached, and the conflict concluded in August 1988. It had endured for close to 8 years, caused an estimated 1 million fatalities, although these figures are disputed, and had yielded no tangible benefits for either faction. Although each party declared victory, the war had actually concluded in a state of stalemate. Peace in Iraq did not persist for an extended period of time following the conclusion of the Iraq-Iran conflict. Undoubtedly, Saddam Hussein was resolute in his intention to employ the final days of the conflict as a pretext to execute a genocide campaign against the Kurdish minority residing in northern Iraq. Kurds are among the most misfortunate ethnic communities of the 21st century. They proliferate in the millions and control a vast expanse of northern Middle Eastern territory, including northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and neighboring regions. Despite their efforts in the aftermath of the First World War, they have been persistently persecuted by the governments of Iraq and Turkey on account of their desire for self-determination. As a result, they have never had their own country in the modern era. Throughout the Iran-Iraq War, a significant number of Kurds and Kurdish political organizations sided with Iran and waged an insurgency against the Iraqi government. As the Iran War neared its conclusion in early 1988, Saddam Hussein issued orders for divisions of Iraqi forces to commence a counterinsurgency operation against the Kurds in northern Iraq. The Al-Anfal campaign, an acronym denoting the spoils of war, was in progress from February 1988 until the latter part of that autumn. It resulted in the deaths of between 50,000 and 100,000 Kurds and the displacement or forcible deportation of tens of thousands more from their homes. In addition to the establishment of detention centers, a coerced Arabization program was initiated. Without a shadow of a doubt, Saddam Hussein successfully executed a genocide program against the Kurds in 1988. Saddam quickly encountered resistance from his averse allies involved in the Iran-Iraq War, including the United States and other Western powers. Throughout the duration of the Iran War, Hussein's regime obtained substantial financial loans in the billions of dollars from Kuwait, a Gulf state renowned for its hydrocarbon reserves and proximity to Iraq. Perhaps as a result of Iraq's total incapability to repay this money, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait shortly after the war with Iran concluded. There were additional mitigating factors at play. Kuwait caused considerable discord within OPEC, the cartel comprising the principal oil exporting countries worldwide that is predominantly focused on the Middle East. Through its insistence on maintaining production levels and barrel export volumes, Kuwait contributed to a decline in global oil prices and adversely affected the financial gains of nations such as Iraq. In addition, the Iraqis asserted that Kuwait had been engaging in unauthorized slant drilling in Iraqi fields. Due to these numerous factors, Iraq launched its invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990. The subsequent dispute does not qualify as a war. A country whose military had grown to become the fourth largest in the world in the 1980s confronted Kuwait, which had no significant military prowess. Saddam's military had captured the majority of Kuwait by the 3rd of August, only one day into the incursion. 24 hours later, the entire nation was under Iraqi control, and Saddam Hussein proclaimed Kuwait to be the 19th province of Iraq, thereby relieving Iraq of its debt to Kuwait and providing it with a new oil-rich region. Saddam appeared to have chosen to invade Kuwait under the erroneous impression that his Western allies would not oppose him because they continued to regard him as a barrier against Iran in the Middle East. He was completely erroneous in his evaluation. The United States and its allies, who essentially controlled the international order by the summer of 1990 following the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, imposed economic and diplomatic sanctions on Iraq within days. The subsequent naval blockade of the Persian Gulf severely impeded Iraq's oil exports, a critical resource for Saddam Hussein's regime and the maintenance of its enormous military apparatus. The escalation of diplomatic tensions occurred due to the efforts of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who persuaded US President George W. Bush to adopt a resolute position against Saddam Hussein. In contrast, Saddam Hussein asserted that he would contemplate a withdrawal from Kuwait provided that concurrent resolution of other territorial disputes in the Middle East, including the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, occurred. He was cognizant of the fact that such a course of action would not be well received by the United States. During the middle to late months of August, he exacerbated the situation by prohibiting Westerners in Iraq from departing the country and even appearing on television with individuals who were essentially British prisoners. As a result, the United States, the United Kingdom, and other nations initiated preparations for a counter-invasion of Kuwait in retaliation against Iraqi aggression. As a rival to the southern oil-rich kingdom, Saudi Arabia would serve as a staging area for the campaign. The onset of the First Gulf War occurred in January 1991, following months of preparation. On January 16, an aerial bombardment campaign was initiated, which was subsequently followed by a land invasion. In early February, as British and American forces poured into Kuwait, Saddam ordered the ignition of the country's oil fields. Approximately 600 out of a total of 730 oil wells situated throughout Kuwait were ignited during the months of January and February 1991. Despite the fact that the environmental damage was comparatively less severe than what certain scientists had predicted, the smoke plumes that resulted in the Middle East absorbed more than 80% of the sun's radiation in 1991. As a consequence, certain areas experienced complete darkness at midday and experienced an average decrease in temperature of 5 degrees Celsius. Until autumn, it would be necessary to extinguish every single fire. By that time, Saddam Hussein's armies had been decisively defeated in Kuwait, following the conclusion of Operation Desert Storm on February 28, 1991. The United States and its allies made the determination to cease hostilities in Kuwait once the Iraqis were expelled. President Bush harbored no intention of prolonging the conflict into Iraqi soil or endeavoring to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. The aforementioned undertaking would be completed by his son more than 10 years later. Although Saddam Hussein managed to endure the consequences of his catastrophically misguided invasion of Kuwait and maintained power throughout the 1990s, the international community imposed a variety of sanctions on Iraq following the conclusion of the Gulf War. A considerable number of these were enforced promptly after the invasion of Kuwait and remained in effect indefinitely. Others were designed to impede the nation's ongoing chemical weapons production or the advancement of its nuclear weapons program, both of which it had instigated several years prior. The most debilitating aspect of this was the embargo on Iraqi oil, which was initiated by the United States. Saddam Hussein's regime and Iraq's economy were heavily reliant on oil exports, given that the country possessed some of the largest verified oil fields and reserves in the world. Despite the 1996 agreement to aid the deteriorating Iraqi economy through the Oil for Food program, the country of Saddam Hussein maintained severe restrictions on what it could and could not import and export for the continuance of his dictatorship. A significant portion of this had an adverse effect on the Iraqi populace. By the conclusion of the 20th century, indicators such as mean wages and infant mortality in Iraq had declined to levels observed 50 years earlier, during the period when the area was under British colonial rule. Following the Gulf War, the Iraqi economy was in ruins during the 1990s, but Saddam Hussein had never been more entrenched in authority than he was beginning in 1991. By refraining from advancing from Kuwait to Iraq in the spring of 1991, the United States effectively conveyed its reluctance to overthrow him from power. For the first time in over a decade, Saddam Hussein was also not confronted with any imminent threat from Iraq's neighbors. The reprehensible encounter with the invasion of Kuwait had additionally appeased him to the reality that Iraq was incapable of waging additional conflicts against its neighbors. Conversely, in the years subsequent to the Gulf War, his focus shifted to mobilizing the populace behind his regime against the perceived aggressive Western powers that had declared war on Iraq in 1990, by utilizing the state apparatus in Iraq. Additionally, a discernible trend towards a more religious autocracy emerged. The Ba'ath Party was established with the aim of promoting secularism in the Middle East. During the late 1970s and 1980s, Saddam Hussein implemented policies that were predominantly secular. However, during the 1990s, there were attempts to exploit Islam as a means to impose a more severe form of despotism in Iraq, coinciding with the significant rise in religious extremism in the region. With the decline of the Iraqi economy in the 1990s and the subsequent degeneration of the nation into a shambles of its former self during the 1960s and 1970s, the Hussein family dictatorship solidified its hold even further. This was most evident in the behavior of Uday and Qassi, Saddam's two sons from his first marriage. Although Qassi was the junior of the two, there was a moment when it became evident that he would have likely succeeded Saddam Hussein had the dictatorship endured for an extended period of time. Additionally, he commanded the Republican Guard. Following the conclusion of the Gulf War in the early 1990s, he oversaw the suppression of a Shiite Muslim uprising in the marshlands of southern Iraq. As a result, he instigated an ecological and demographic catastrophe in the area through the flooding of these marshlands, which aimed to eradicate the centuries-old traditional way of life of the Shiite Arabs who had settled there. However, despite the fact that Qassi's conduct was problematic, it was insignificant in contrast to that of his older sibling Uday. Uday, an infamous alcoholic, rapist, murderer, and psychotic, organized gatherings in Baghdad where he incentivized attendees to consume copious amounts of alcohol prior to participating in a variety of abhorrent deeds. There have been accounts suggesting that during his tenure of terror, he routinely subjected members of the Iraqi football team to torture in the event of defeat. By the mid-1990s, his conduct had become exceedingly erratic, frequently manifesting at gatherings in Baghdad while armed and utilizing firearms. Consequently, his immediate family members deemed themselves perilously imperiled and fled to the adjacent country of Jordan. In addition, there were numerous allegations that Uday routinely subjected his own employees to foot whippings by his bodyguards, and that during the 1990s he was a notorious serial rapist who would frequently peruse the streets of Baghdad in his collection of sports cars in search of women to transport to one of his palaces. In late 1996, a thwarted assassination attempt rendered him partially paralyzed in one leg. This setback had no effect on his most extreme behavior. In spite of the fact that Saddam was apparently cognizant of his eldest son's abhorrent behavior as late as the late 1980s, he took minimal measures to rein in his behavior. Uday consequently inflicted atrocities upon the inhabitants of Baghdad during the 1990s and early 2000s. One of the less widely recognized yet intriguing aspects pertaining to Saddam was his written output during the early 2000s. During this time, Hussein authored 4 novels and a number of poems, frequently with the assistance of ghostwriters. These works were either published in Iraq prior to his ousting from power, or later, at his daughter's from his first marriage's insistence. The initial among these was Zabida and the Monarch, an account of a medieval woman named Zabida who develops an intimate relationship with an Iraqi monarch in the early 7th and 8th centuries, during the period of Arab and Muslim rule in this region. Consensus holds that the novel, which is set in Saddam Hussein's native Tikrit, serves as an allegory for the purported devastation of Iraq caused by sanctions imposed by the United States-led coalition following the First Gulf War. While the authorship of this was only indicated as written by he who wrote it, consensus holds that Hussein was the creator. Men and the City, a narrative of the Hussein family's involvement in the Ottoman conquest of Iraq in the early 20th century and the subsequent rise of the Ba'ath Party in the area, was among the subsequent books published in 2001 and 2002. Saddam Hussein authored the document in question, according to prevailing opinion, almost entirely, as a manuscript bearing his distinctive handwriting was discovered subsequent to the United States' 2003 invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein's perception of the United States as the dominant force responsible for undermining Iraq and its potential was not entirely inaccurate. Undoubtedly, the imposition of Western sanctions against Iraq during the 1990s and early 2000s resulted in a deterioration of living conditions in the country. As a consequence of the restrictions placed on the Iraqi import economy, certain goods became unattainable or prohibitively expensive for the populace. However, it is indisputable that Saddam Hussein and his unscrupulous family regime contributed to this situation in Iraq by failing to disclose their efforts to develop weapons of mass destruction. The imposition of economic and political sanctions against Iraq in the aftermath of the First Gulf War was invariably contingent on Saddam Hussein and his regime's compliance in divesting the nation of all such weaponry. While it is true that Hussein's government formally abandoned all chemical weapons in 1991, persistent endeavors persisted in the 1990s to develop additional weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical and biological weapons like mustard gas, sarin gas, and anthrax. Inspectors from the United Nations discovered in the mid-1990s that similar chemicals and compounds had been manufactured in Iraq in the years following the Gulf War and had likely been used to experiment on inmates at Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad. Subsequent UN inspections, however, demonstrated unequivocally that Saddam Hussein's regime lacked a significant and operational capability to employ weapons of mass destruction against foreign countries. In contrast, Saddam Hussein's regime's complete lack of cooperation with UN inspectors after a 1998 UN inspection could potentially tilt the scales in his favor in this regard. The determination of whether Saddam Hussein maintained intentions to develop a nuclear program or chemical and biological weapons during the 1990s and early 2000s would ultimately emerge as a pivotal concern, culminating in the downfall of his regime and his demise around the middle of the 2000s. The Islamic terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, initiated a sequence of assaults against the United States on September 11, 2001. The most significant of these assaults was the hijacking and destruction of 2 commercial aircraft on the east coast of America, which were subsequently directed towards the Twin Towers in downtown Manhattan, New York. As a reaction, the War on Terror was initiated by the administration of President George W. Bush, who succeeded his father as the president who had supervised the withdrawal of Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait a decade prior. Its objective was to depose regimes in the Islamic world and the Middle East that had provided support to al-Qaeda. Reasonably, this commenced with an invasion of Afghanistan, where bin Laden was at the time receiving protection. As soon as the occupation of Afghanistan concluded, senior officials under the Bush administration shifted their focus to Iraq. Although there was no evidence to suggest that Saddam had assisted Osama bin Laden in any way, the United States justified its intervention in Iraq on the illusory grounds that Saddam was on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons. The lack of substantial evidence, which would subsequently be disproven, caused divisions in the Western world regarding support or opposition to the proposed invasion of Iraq. Nevertheless, the Bush administration, backed by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, proceeded with its plans and initiated preparations for the invasion in Iraq in the spring of 2003. A quarter century into his rule, Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was nearing its conclusion. At first glance, the United States invasion of Iraq, also known as the Second Gulf War, appeared to be an exceptionally effective military operation targeting Hussein's regime. A few weeks were devoted to the conventional conflict that occurred during the spring of 2003. This resulted in a joint US-British force and small contingents of Allied troops from various US allies invading Iraq from the south. However, traditional allies of Washington and London, including the French and Germans, condemned the invasion as a war of adventure and refused to participate. Shock and Awe was the codename given to a mid-March 2003 bombing campaign that involved coalition forces comprising more than 500,000 men, Peshmerga Kurds, and other disaffected groups within Iraq that allied with the United States as part of the operation. These forces advanced into southern Iraq. The events that transpired during the subsequent 3 weeks hardly constituted a war. Despite being ostensibly formidable and numerous, the Iraqi armed forces completely disintegrated when confronted by the forces of the preeminent military power in the world. Following the initial assault, United States and Allied forces promptly advanced towards Baghdad, successfully seizing and occupying the capital of Iraq on April 9. Saddam and his family, as well as the Iraqi administration, had departed Baghdad by that juncture. Saddam Hussein's homeland, Tikrit, was surrounded by last-ditch efforts to repel the United States and their allies until mid-April. 6 weeks after the campaign's inception, on May 1, President George W. Bush traveled to Iraq and proclaimed the conclusion of significant combat and the campaign's victory. However, this assessment was extremely premature, and although the Ba'athists may have been defeated in the spring of 2003, the subsequent military occupation of Iraq by the United States and the United Kingdom incited an assortment of religious and political discontents that ensured the absence of peace in the country for the foreseeable future. As the Allied forces approached Baghdad, Saddam Hussein, his family, and a significant number of high-ranking Ba'athist regime officials fled the capital and entered a state of concealment. As a consequence, the United States Army provided decks of playing cards featuring images of the 52 most elusive Iraqis to Marines stationed in Iraq. Saddam was dealt the Ace of Spades, whereas his sons Qassi and Uday were dealt the Ace of Clubs and Ace of Hearts, respectively. In due course, the last two individuals would be located. Uday and Qassi were apprehended by American forces on April 9, 2003, and were fatally engaged in a military confrontation in the city of Mosul. They had unsuccessfully attempted to cross the border into Syria. Saddam was likely already in the Tikrit region at that time, where he managed to remain in concealment for over 6 months despite one of the most extensive manhunts in history. Hussein was not apprehended in its entirety until December 13, 2003, when Operation Red Dawn was successful in apprehending him subsequent to an acquaintance of his having disclosed his whereabouts. It was a humiliating final hiding place for the former dictator, as American troops extracted him that day in a disheveled state from what amounted to a hole in the earth. The Iraqi Special Tribunal was established by the US occupation government 4 days prior to Saddam Hussein's capture. Its purpose was to bring to justice prominent individuals of the Iraqi regime and military who were suspected of committing crimes against humanity or participating in the attempted genocide against Iraq's Kurds. This tribunal would now preside over Hussein's trial. While awaiting prosecution, he was transferred to Camp Cropper in Baghdad, where he was detained alongside an estimated dozen other senior Ba'athists. They would reside there for more than 15 months prior to the commencement of Saddam Hussein's trial on October 19, 2005. Upon the court's eventual commencement following the protracted postponement, Saddam Hussein declined to acknowledge its legitimacy, asserting that he could not stand trial by an entity he perceived as a kangaroo court under the control of foreign invaders of Iraq. He refused to cooperate with the proceedings for the following several months, asserting that his captors had subjected him to torture and that one of his attorneys had been murdered during the trial. As a consequence, Saddam embarked on a hunger strike in 2006. However, his protests came to no avail. The trial continued in the absence of his cooperation, and on November 6, 2006, over a year after it had begun, Saddam Hussein was convicted of numerous crimes, including crimes against humanity, committed during his lengthy reign as dictator of Iraq. His sentence was execution by hanging. Saddam's legal team filed an appeal following his conviction and death sentence. However, the appeal was dismissed within a few weeks, and an order was issued mandating the execution to be executed within 30 days. Since some of those tasked with securing the former dictator have stated, his final days were extraordinarily peculiar. 12 individuals affiliated with the 551st Military Police Company were implicated. The individuals present described Saddam Hussein's final days as he consumed muffins, listened to Mary J. Blige recordings, and sporadically regaled his captors with anecdotes from his reign as the ruler of Iraq. Additionally, he was granted a small garden allotment, which he consistently tended to remove weeds. A number of his former dictatorial characteristics remained apparent. When he made a breakfast request for an omelette, he insisted that it be returned if in any way the exterior was damaged during removal from the pan. Apart from this, he devoted a substantial amount of time to riding an exercise cycle, which he likened to his pony. It concluded with an unusual chapter in his life. On December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed by hanging at Camp Justice in Baghdad, a development that incited jubilation among specific segments of the Iraqi population. The final supper of the dictator consisted of chicken and rice accompanied by hot water and honey. His demand to be put to death by firing squad was not granted. Following this, his remains were repatriated to his place of origin and interred in a familial cemetery in Tikrit. Notwithstanding the sincere aspirations of numerous individuals in the United States administration that Saddam Hussein's execution and the complete deconstruction of the Ba'athist regime would result in a complete democratization of the country, no such revolution transpired. Iraq had, in fact, descended into anarchy even throughout the months that Saddam Hussein was imprisoned and awaiting prosecution. While the country held its first legitimate parliamentary elections in January 2005 under a caretaker government that was established in June 2004, civil war broke out across the nation as religious extremists, led by the cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, effectively established their own militias in Baghdad and throughout the country. The United States administration was compelled to establish a green zone in Baghdad, a densely fortified and defended district that served as the sole significant region in the country where American personnel were exempt from apprehension regarding potential assaults. This was due to the widespread attacks on U.S. military personnel. When Saddam Hussein was deposed in 2006, United States Army personnel reported that they had lost effective control over portions of the country. The American position was rekindled the following year due to a troop surge, but Iraq was not ultimately transformed in the manner that had been envisioned in 2003. Since the United States withdrew progressively from the country in 2011, it has been a breeding ground for instability and insurrection. Notably, during the mid-2010s, the Islamic State established dominance over significant portions of the northern region. Furthermore, the early 2020s have been marked by renewed political unrest. Consequently, although Saddam Hussein has been absent for an extended period of time, the political anarchy that he and the Ba'athists sow in that region endures. Saddam Hussein was without a doubt one of the most ruthless dictators in world history. During the 1960s and 1970s, he advocated for the Ba'athist movement, a political entity that, despite its flaws, had an initial socialist and pan-Arabist ideology that provided some foundation for its cause. In contrast, Saddam Hussein possessed no ideological foundation beyond the acquisition of power. He began to monopolize it during the 1970s, and by the late 1970s, he had assumed the position of de facto dictator of Iraq. His tenure in that position had catastrophic consequences for the Iraqi populace as well as those of several neighboring nations. He ordered the widespread use of chemical weapons and sank Iraq and Iran into one of the bloodiest conflicts of the post-Second World War era, one that persisted for the majority of the 1980s, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Following that, he initiated genocide against the Iraqi Kurds prior to his invasion of Kuwait. In the 1990s, Iraq was subjected to an unprecedented string of international sanctions as a result of these actions, which further diminished the standard of living for the average Iraqi citizen. The final decade of his regime was marked by an escalating despotism exemplified by the heinous conduct of his sons and other regime members. Although there was considerable skepticism regarding the true motivations of the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq and whether it was a war of adventure to secure control of the country's vast oil reserves, a claim contested by numerous scholars, it is indisputable that the invasion effectively brought an end to a brutal dictatorship and tyrant. In your opinion, what is Saddam Hussein? Among the most ruthless dictators of the 20th century, did he genuinely rank alongside Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Joseph Stalin? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.